Next, let's look at the anatomy of the thalamus. We show an isolated view of the thalamus, and again, as we pointed out earlier, it is largely an egg or a football-shaped structure. The thalamus is partially subdivided by an internal medullary lamina, that's illustrated here, that subdivides the thalamus into an anterior nuclear group, a medial nuclear group, and a ventral tier of nuclei that basically constitutes the largest number of thalamic nuclei and some of the most functionally specific. So starting with the major players and the ones to remember in the thalamus, they're listed first on this chart. First off, recognize the difference in the relay functionality of VPM and VPL. These are situated together and form what some neurologists refer to as the ventrobasal complex. But recognize these two are our somatosensory relay nuclei, VPL functioning to relay sensory information from the body, trunk, and limbs, whereas VPM relaying the same kinds of sensory information plus taste from cranial nerve innervated territories, largely in the face, oral cavity, and nasal cavity. In front of the ventrobasal complex are the motor nuclei of the thalamus, and these two are VA and VL, whose job is to relay basal ganglia and cerebellar outflow up to upper motor neurons in various parts of motor cortex. Then, the smallest of the ventral tier nuclei, but again functionally specific, are the two geniculate bodies. One is the lateral geniculate body, that's our visual relay nucleus, L for light, that's the lateral. The medial geniculate body is our auditory thalamic relay nucleus that's relaying auditory information from the inferior colliculus up to primary auditory cortex, and M for music, helps us remember that it's an auditory processing center. Then, the secondary players, less well understood functionally, are the single nucleus that constitutes the anterior group, as well as the dorsal-medial or medial-dorsal nucleus that constitutes the medial group. Both of these thalamic nuclei are part of the limbic system and play some not well understood role in memory consolidation, our ability to take a newly learned experience and convert it into a short and then a long-term stored memory. So the anterior nucleus is a distinct part of a limbic system circuit called the PAPE circuit that links the hippocampus, a major limbic system structure, through the thalamus with the cingulate gyrus on the medial aspect of each hemisphere, which is a major locus of limbic system cortex. The medial-dorsal nucleus is a limbic-related nucleus, but its claim to fame is that, like the mammillary bodies, as we'll see, it is a preferential site of neuronal degeneration seen in patients who are chronic abusers of alcohol and develop the associated thiamine deficiency. So these neurons, when they degenerate, cause a patient with Wernicke-Korsakoff psychosis to develop a combination of both anterograde and retrograde amnesia with confabulations. The less well understood and specific nuclei are the pulvinar, probably the largest nucleus in the entire ventral tier. It's an integrative thalamic nucleus that's helping to process a combination of highly processed somatosthetic, visual, and auditory input to widespread areas of cortex. And finally, not shown in this diagram are the so-called midline or interlaminar nuclei that function in sleep-wake cycles and in arousal. And just putting it in text version, a little more detailed description of the same regional areas. Here again is the anterior nuclear group. As we said, it's part of the limbic system. It's linking input from the mammillary bodies up to limbic cortex. And like the mammillary bodies, it is part of the so-called PAPE circuit of limbic system connections. And here we make the point again that less well understood connectionally as well as functionally is this medial nuclear group, again part of the limbic system. The most important nucleus is that dorsal medial or medial dorsal nucleus, which we said preferentially is a site of degeneration in patients with Korsakoff's psychosis. Then, the ventral group, the most common and most well known, and typically the ones to remember. The motor nuclei are VA and VL. VA seems to be purely a basal ganglia relay nucleus, whereas VL seems to relay information from both basal ganglia structures, globus pallidus, as well as the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum. All of the output, or virtually all of the output, of both of these motor nuclei, VA and VL, is to upper motor neurons found in primary motor cortex. Then, the favorite somatosensory nuclei are VPM and VPL. VPL is our body somatosensory relay nucleus, which is the thalamic relay for both the dorsal column medial lemniscal system and the spinal thalamic tract, relaying all of that general body wall sensation to primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. VPM is the cranial nerve equivalent of that, relaying general sensation from the trigeminal territories to conscious levels of cortex, as well as being the taste relay for solitary nucleus input that is also conveyed to a similar cortical area. And then, again, the geniculate bodies, we don't need to repeat it. We simply need to remember that the medial geniculate is music, therefore auditory, and the lateral geniculate body is relaying light, visual information out of the thalamus back up to primary visual cortex, which is in the medial aspect of each temporal lobe. And then, midline and interlaminar, we know that A, they are involved in arousal, but note that the interlaminar nuclei are also a secondary destination, a secondary thalamic nucleus which receives input from the spinal thalamic tract. And the reason is this interlaminar thalamic information is played into the limbic system, particularly the cingulate gyrus, to help us remember that what generated a painful stimulus should be avoided in the future. Then, as we've already indicated, thiamine deficiency in alcoholic patients has some fairly widespread patterns of degeneration and effects in the central nervous system. Thiamine deficiency that constitutes Korsakoff psychosis results in neuronal degeneration in two of the diencephalic nuclei, the dorsal medial nucleus of the thalamus and the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus, and also affects hippocampal neurons and, as we've seen, affects Purkinje cells in the anterior firmus of the cerebellum. Secondarily, if a patient has an isolated lacunar stroke involving the ventral nuclear group, they present with thalamic pain syndrome. And in this case, since we have affected by lesion the ventral basal complex, the patient might lose vibratory and touch modality sensations because the VPM and VPL are the only sites of that kind of modality relay. But because pain also relays through other thalamic nuclei, patients with a thalamic lesion present with the presence of burning, aching pain, contralateral location that's resistant to over-the-counter and script analgesic medications.